On the bill.
Thank you, members. My name is Judy Kostura. I'm here on behalf of the Texas Trial Lawyers Association to speak on the bill. While we favor the requirement of $1 million of liability insurance coverage after a ride assignment is accepted, and we are pleased that there is at least more than minimum coverage in that threshold time between turning on the app and accepting the assignment, we don't think that this bill does all that Brad Nail said it will do. When he says the goal is to protect at all times against any gaps, there are some gaps. In fact, there is no requirement in this bill that either the driver or the TNC provide any form of uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage to the driver or the passengers. My concern is that the drivers actually lose their personal uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage as soon as they turn on the app. So if they are the responsible person who follows Texas law and carries that coverage, which Texas statute says agents are required to offer to drivers, as soon as they lose their personal coverage, which this bill authorizes personal lines carriers to exclude, they're bare. Now, both Uber and Lyft say, and I applaud them for this, that they are currently providing $1 million of uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage for the protection of their driver and passengers. This law doesn't require them to do that. And so while I appreciate that they are doing that voluntarily, I'm also concerned that if at any point they stopped doing it voluntarily, the driver and passengers would be bare. There is another gap that this bill doesn't address, although the bill is beautiful. It does not address times when the passenger may turn to the driver and say, "This has been a great trip. I'm going to be at this location where you brought me for an hour," rather than me going back through the app to schedule a return trip. "You've been wonderful. Will you just come pick me up in an hour?" And if they don't go through the app, whether it's to save money or because they don't know how to use that app and can't get it to download, maybe somebody else set up the original trip, or maybe they're going to 6th Street on a Friday night and they just are worried at 2 o'clock in the morning they might not be quite as adept at fingering that app. For whatever reason, if they set up a ride off the app, then there is no coverage because the personal lines will exclude it. Wait, your driver is taking you for a fee, so the personal lines will exclude it.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Representative Sheets.
Okay, I understand where you're going.
Okay.
So let me get you really quickly to say who should have coverage at that point, the personal lines or the carrier's coverage? I mean, because they're not working under the umbrella of the transportation company at that point. They're operating under their own purview. So this becomes a problem of the driver, not necessarily the company. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, it becomes a problem for the citizens of the state of Texas. If that driver hits somebody,
right,
then there's no coverage. It becomes a problem for the passenger. The disclosure that is mandated in this bill that the TNCs have to tell the passengers, by the way, your driver's personal coverage isn't going to cover them while they're engaged in services, doesn't go a step further and say, and by the way, if you arrange a private ride, you're losing that coverage too. As far as who should bear that loss, I would say not the citizens.
Right, and I understand where you're going, but now we got to talk. We're talking about theory. Let's talk about practicality, because the practicality is at this point the TNC's out of the picture. They're not engaged in they're not facilitating anymore.
They may say they are out of the picture, but that is how the introduction got made.
Okay.
And so
this is very indirect, though. I mean, you're taking an indirect, because yes, the original ride was facilitated by the TNC,
Right.
but now you got a rogue agent. And you can't hold the TNC responsible for someone who's going rogue, can you?
Well, just last week in the Transportation Committee, we heard from a young man whose mother set up the ride because the young man is disabled. The TNC driver took him to the doctor's office, realized, oh my gosh, I just dropped this young man off. He's disabled. His mother set it up, and she didn't know when the doctor's appointment was going to be finished. So, a very heartwarming story. He went and found the young man and said, listen, you're not able to set up this app on your own. I'll take you home, make sure you get home safely. I mean, there was nothing rogue.
Did he charge him?
I assume so.
Okay, because if you didn't charge him, then you don't have a commercial venture. Now you have
Correct.
an act of charity.
Correct. I assume there was a charge. That discussion didn't get had. Just the heartwarming story of the Uber driver who searched the halls of the doctor's office to find the young man to take him home.
But we have no verification. We only have assumptions and speculation right now.
We have anecdotal stories that this does happen, and my concern is there is no coverage. So
The question is, which, and that gets down to the bare bones of this. Which company are you wanting to have coverage? The personal lines, the carrier providing coverage for personal lines for the driver himself, or the carrier providing coverage for the TNC?
Either one. I mean, the testimony today has been that the insurance companies and the TNC companies got together and worked out a compromise bill that everybody feels good about. I think there's one area that they left out. And however they solve it, as long as it's solved, will be good.
And I understand your concern, but here's my concern, is you want to hold the TNCs potentially responsible when they're not at fault because they got someone operating rogue. And even in the heartwarming story where the guy goes and hunts the guy down in the doctor's office, he's operating outside the procedure, so he's gone rogue. Okay? You can be acting with good faith and still being going rogue.
Heroically rogue, yes.
Okay? Then you got the personal lines coverage that provides an exclusion in there. It's very clear. If you operate your vehicle for commercial purposes, you don't have coverage. And
Understood.
so you don't have the carrier operating in bad faith. You don't have the TNC operating in bad faith. You got the operator of the vehicle who's operating outside the bounds of either his agreement with the TNC or his agreement with his insurance carrier.
That's true.
And so it's that guy, and I understand you're talking about the motoring public. I mean, I've been hit by an uninsured driver, and it's not fun. But the question is, from a public policy standpoint, are we going to hold other entities responsible for other people's rogue behavior? I'm not going to say bad behavior, but because I guess there's times like you just described where someone's not acting in bad faith, but they are acting outside of what the contract that they're operating under that would provide them coverage is there for.
I am not here to pick which of those carriers should bear that risk. I am here to point out that when the testimony is we're covering all the gaps, no, we're not. And we have a problem in Texas with drivers, having a substantial number of drivers who are uninsured. And so, one, I think we need to mandate that there be uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage in this bill provided by the TNCs, not just voluntarily, and I do applaud them for doing that voluntarily, but make sure that it is part of the statute.
And I'm not disagreeing with you there. Right. It's the second point you're making. I have a problem from a fairness point of view and from a contractual point of view, holding somebody responsible for somebody operating outside the bounds of where they're supposed to be.
I understand that, and I would be happy with any reasonable compromise that the TNCs and insurance companies come up with that does not provide a gap.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have a more simple question.
Okay.
Because I'm just trying to make sure I properly understand the language of the bill itself. Because I guess having not actually read all of this proposed statute, what I was contemplating was that there's a window of time when the application is not on, and that would be on the personal or private policy. Then there's a period where the application is on, correct? So it would be app on to app off. And then within that period of time, there's a window where they actually have someone with them in the vehicle. And where I'm going with that is that if that app on to app off is covered, right, then by the professional policy, if you will, then whether they drop somebody off and wait for an hour or go do another pickup, or if the app is on, then I would think that they would be covered, albeit at the lesser rate because they don't have somebody physically with them in the vehicle.
Well, if
But
they've
or is
arranged
that
a
a
private ride,
misunderstanding?
I think that may be a misunderstanding, because
Okay.
if they've arranged a private ride, they may not have their app on while they're transporting somebody, because they're not available while they are picking somebody up to say, I'll go pick somebody else
Well,
up too.
It seems to me if it's a private activity, then it goes back to being private and not relevant to the TNC and to their professional activity.
Unless it's considered a commercial activity by the State Farm, Allstate, Progressive, because in fact the driver is carrying somebody for a fee. And this bill simply doesn't address that potential.
Yeah, that okay. I don't know if that'd be an interesting thing to try and address. You're saying they're conducting a private activity, but it's not a private activity, but it's not part of their TNC activity. I mean, I guess I would think it's either private or it's not. I mean, what happens today if somebody completely outside of being part of a transportation network says, hey, I'll give you a ride for $20. What happens then?
Those issues do get litigated, and you can lose your personal coverage. But that's something we may see on an ad hoc, once in a blue moon basis. I think we are opening the door to it more in this bill. Or at least the TNCs are opening the door and we're not covering it. As well as the fact that drivers are losing their uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage, and we're not doing anything to make sure that the voluntary coverage that's being provided right now stays in place.
Well, do you think there would be an incentive for drivers who are participating in a transportation, a TNC type system to then say, oh, for this moment, I just want to do this on my own? I mean, are you suggesting that's going to occur more frequently now? Or that they would secure somebody through their app and then turn it off and cut a private deal with them? Or I mean, is that...
That certainly can happen, and anecdotally I've heard has happened, and I don't know that we've got any stats on it.
Okay. Well, would you say this would at least be a step in the right direction with the proposed legislation?
Certainly, especially if we added a requirement that there be uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage in place, just as there is on a voluntary basis right now by the TNCs.
Okay, thank you.
Members, are there any other questions? Well, thank you for your testimony.